I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 5th of December, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Leon, Nicaragua. Today I want to talk about the topic of government instability because this gets mentioned to me a lot as a reason why people are choosing a place or avoiding a place or just have some concerns they've heard about government instability one place or another. And I want to talk about a number of factors around this, including what exactly does that mean? Why are people concerned about it? And so forth. So we're going to tackle that right after the bump. But before we go to today's bump, I do want to give my online condolences to the family of Paul Damon. For those who watch my channel, a great number of you, probably the majority, are familiar with Paul's channel as well. I know Paul really only through our YouTuber circles here in Nicaragua. This is a very small community, especially of those of us who are doing English language YouTube. And I just learned a few hours ago that Paul has passed away. I don't know any details. The last time I saw him posting in his own voice was about 2 weeks ago, so I don't know exactly the timing of things or what has occurred. But my condolences to his family and those that he has left behind. That is certainly a major impact to the YouTuber community here in Central America. Today I want to talk about government instability because few things are mentioned to me more often. And of course these things come in waves. For a long time I heard nothing about government instability as a factor for anyone considering anything at all. And I'm sure we can guess why. I expect that there is some change in government publications or propaganda being used as just trends generally. And government stability has become one of those factors that is being pushed as a reason to worry about traveling abroad to different places. And this is interesting because the majority of these concerns or warnings seem to come from the United States. And it's normal that when we get warnings about things from the United States, for example, increases in violence or concerns about COVID infection rates, normally those things are reflections of things that are going wrong in the United States. The more that the US is facing a current problem domestically, it becomes the message that they apply internationally, presumably one, because it's on their minds in the people who are writing these materials, because generally these warnings from the US tend to be from inside the country, not from what's actually happening on the outside, but also because Americans are currently worried about these things, right? The United States is currently going through an extreme degree of government instability. There's a ton of fear of a past insurrection, of fear of a loss of democratic processes, a failure of democratic institutions. There's a doubt as to the efficacy of the voting process and voting machines and people who are watching over those systems, and a lack of comfort at a national level with the court systems, especially the Supreme Court, now that they are widely known to have been involved in conspiracy theories and bribery and abject lack of ethics. And so when these things happen in the US, we see it projected into other places, presumably because Americans will be very sensitive to it. They're already, even if not thinking about it actively, they're afraid of instability in their own country. And so when it's mentioned in other places, it's easy to make them worried that those places might be worse. So let's start with a couple facts, right? Some really big important things. The first is, as an expat, does stability of a government actually affect you? So this is an important question because a lot of times the things that people tell me are their top concerns when looking at countries outside their home country. We often assume you're coming from the United States, but you could be coming from almost anywhere. But often their concerns are things that when we actually ask or really dig into it, it's, why are you actually concerned about this thing at all? You may, traditionally we see things like, well, you may not want to go there, it's not democratic. You may not want to go there because their vote isn't something. You may not want to go there because all these different political things. And as someone who is an expat, none of those things actually affect you. You're generally, it doesn't matter where you go in the world. If you're an expat, you can't vote. How the government works, how the people want their government to work, whether it's representing them well or not, none of those things actually affect you. You may be just generally unhappy because you want the people around you to be represented a certain way or whatever, but that's a really weird projection of our own desires and something that is generally on a global scale considered to be incredibly inappropriate. Of course, you can always have those feelings. That's fine. But generally having those feelings, the entire idea that other people's governments are our business is a very American thing. And I think you'll find that European travelers going to other countries have much less reaction like that. They're much more likely to find an interest in how a government works rather than have an opinion as to how they should change it, unless they actively see local people unable to change it, but trying to do so. But as long as the people have spoken and created a government that is what they want, it is almost completely an Americanism to go and say, no, that's not the right way to run a government, right? That is the idea that foreigners would be involved in another country's government. While it does happen anywhere, most places accept that that is meddling, that is interference. But Americans are often taught that it is kind of a mandate to go and spread what is nearly a religious fervor for what is not really even a democratic process around the world. And the U.S. has quite a trend of overthrowing democratic institutions when the vote doesn't go the way that they want. So the U.S. is actually, on a global scale, very anti-democracy under most circumstances. If you look at countries that it has been involved with historically, especially in Latin America, democracy is the last thing that the United States wants outside of itself. And inside, generally on a global scale, we don't really consider what the U.S. has to be exactly a democracy. There are some democratic processes, but there is a lot of non-democratic ones as well. And so it doesn't meet most international standards for being classified as a democracy. But given the amount of power that it has, most institutions are unwilling to take on the United States in that way. They know that it's such a prime example of failed democratic processes that it is just known the world over as not meeting those standards, but it's not something you can talk about. So this first thing, though, like a little bit of a rant, that's not the idea. The idea is that what you hear about other countries and their governments is often very misleading, because the most important piece is you just don't care. What you care about are the things that draw you to the country, and those things are generally the results of or the reflection of whatever that government is doing. It's not how it came to be, not how it made its decisions, but what decisions it's made. For example, if you're moving to a country because you like its tax status or tax regime, if you're moving there because you like its weather, is obviously not a government-controlled thing. If you're moving there because of the ability to own a home or to rent a home, or how easy it is to get a visa, or how safe you are and how well protected you are by the police, or how easily you can fly to another country. In many cases, in most cases, those factors are either directly created by whatever government system they had or have had in the past, or they are in some way enabled by it, right? Maybe the government doesn't assign which airlines are going to fly to where and which ones have which flight paths, but their taxation, their friendliness with different nations will eventually encourage different airlines to do different things that may be good or bad for you. So all those kinds of things, the results of many of the aspects of a government, of a country, create an environment that is either conducive to or non-conducive to expat life for you. For one expat, one place will be great. For another will be great. We talked about this in yesterday's episode with generic expats, where here in Nicaragua, we have a political environment that is extremely conducive to digital nomads. If you want to work for someone remotely but live in Nicaragua, there's really nobody offering a set of tax and political incentives as strong as Nicaragua. But if what you want to do is open a manufacturing company inside of a country and work and hire inside, while you can certainly do that in Nicaragua, there are other countries that have tax incentives and political incentives that are more likely to encourage you to do that. And in some cases, there's things that are non-political as well. Maybe they have a larger workforce, or they have better access to larger ports, or direct land access to countries that are going to consume those goods. A lot of things that the government can't control, but many things they can. Education being a big one, where a government may encourage certain types of education, for example, science and math for engineering workloads, or education towards manufacturing for more labor-intensive workloads. And depending on those educational decisions long ago by government, those generally takes like a 20-year period for those things to really take strong effect, 5 to 10 for them to start to work into society, but closer to 20 for them to really take hold, because you need more than just 1 or 2 students coming out of a program to make it really impactful to a scale of a nation. those kinds of decisions would also encourage. Like if you're teaching manufacturing, well, let's say Honduras teaches loads of manufacturing skills. Well, that alone may encourage someone to build a factory there because they have access to all these human resources that make so much sense. But if they were instead teaching a lot of artistic things, maybe putting a design school or a design studio there would make more sense, because those are the skills that are available. So the government plays a lot of roles in those ways. As an expat, depending on the things you want to do, depending on the things that matter to you, the results of any government are often the factors that draw you to or make you avoid certain countries. But it shouldn't be what that government actually is the mechanisms that it uses to make those decisions, because it's not your government. So those under the hood artifacts are purely the business of the voters or the populace of that country, not of you as an expat. And it really has no effect on you, and it's not your business. The combination of it's none of your business and you're not impacted by it. That's the important thing. That often when people are traveling, they're like, oh, I don't know if, I have this ability, people can't vote the way that I like in said country. And it's like, but you didn't have the right to vote either way. It has nothing to do with you. You're talking about some other group of voters, and often it's the voting that they chose or their ancestors chose. So that's the first piece. When it comes to stability, we have more or less the same thing. If you're coming to a country, and we'll pick some prime examples that just happened, both Brazil and Argentina have had major shifts of governments. We could argue that they are unstable in a practical way, meaning they've already had changes that are dramatic enough that we would call them unstable. And it doesn't mean that these countries are going to fall apart. It doesn't mean that there's danger as an expat. It doesn't mean that being an expat may change at all. The fact that the government itself is flipping around may have a profound impact on expats. Maybe you get kicked out and you're not allowed to stay anymore. Maybe your taxes go through the roof, or heavy taxes go away. All kinds of things could change. Maybe you need a visa where you didn't before. Maybe your 180 days turns into 15 days and you really got to panic and figure things out. Of course, government instability could result in things that are negative for you, but traditionally most government instability has little to no impact on outsiders whatsoever. It's something that, again, the who's in charge and what they do and how they do it may change dramatically. And certainly if you're the citizen of one of these countries, you may see changes that are really dramatic for you. And even as an expat, for example, in Argentina, there is a certain expectation that there may be a change of the currency in the country, moving from the Argentinian peso to potentially the US dollar as the major currency within the country. And a few years ago, we saw a similar change in El Salvador, where they moved from the US dollar to Bitcoin. That caused a little bit of upheaval for everyone, but they also ended up keeping the US dollar in the long run. At least at this point, they still keep it. And so it's not like you had to switch to Bitcoin, but it did cause a lot of changes in society. New ATMs, people talking about it. It changed the culture a little bit. As an expat, of course, you're affected by that, so maybe that's important for you, but it wasn't a major change. It wasn't a sudden change, and it isn't a dramatic thing that makes expats feel they have to leave. It just changed the culture a little bit. In Argentina, we expect very much the same thing. They've had a major change of government. They may have a change of currency. They're definitely going to have a lot of changes of economic policy. But as an expat, it may influence when and where you want to invest, how you want to invest. It may, over the long haul, start to alter house values, for example, property values, and we expect any major change would do that. But those things are very slow and gradual, and you have time to look and say, are these effects things that are going to discourage me or encourage me to go to one location or another? And in most cases, the factors that are going to be so minor that change in such minor ways that if a country was the right place for you before, it will probably remain so afterwards. It's very rare that a change of government would change the culture so much that it makes your decisions different. And when it does, it normally makes those decisions very close to being the same. You're not looking at major changes. The only time that we really see government instability as such a dramatic factor, at least in Latin America, where it would really change how you look at a country and whether you consider it for where you want to live, is generally when there's U.S. intervention. When the U.S. has gone into countries, Peru, Chile, places like that, it often does so militarily and so dramatically that it causes huge cultural uprisings, and that can create a lot of instability because the U.S. does have a tendency to encourage land grabs, does having a tendency to encourage violence inside the countries, and those countries have seen some really horrible things happen. Lots of countries have when the U.S. has suddenly interfered. In those cases, you're, as an American or as most Westerners and expats, you basically always have an opportunity to flee that country. That's not a great answer, but government instability generally comes from the outside, and it's not something you can predict. You can't look at Chile in 1972 and say, oh, things are going to be crazy next year because the U.S. is going to overthrow the government. That's not something you could have known. Looking at Chile in 1972, you would have said, this is completely stable. We're totally safe. Well, let's choose it because of the stability. And you would do the same thing today. But because of the 1973 intervention by the United States, it became suddenly extremely unstable for a period of time, but there was no way to predict it. So knowing that stability is generally not a factor in whether or not we actually should be considering a country or not, we also have the problem that we have a really poor ability to define what stability even is. There's two major ways to look at stability. One is what has happened in the past, meaning the recent past, things that are currently applicable, and that could include current events as well, of course, or to look at projections of what could happen in the future. For example, the United States has been moderately unstable for the last very many years. There's a constant flipping of government. There's a lot of government infighting. There's a lot of corruption issues. There's a lot of democratic questionability going on. Those things lean towards instability, but the actual level of instability has not been that bad. However, just because it's managed to remain generally stable, however, there was an armed insurrection, there have been major problems that put the United States right on the verge of collapse. They did not actually happen. So we have the problem of, was it almost certainly going to happen? Was it possible it was going to happen? Was it never a real chance whatsoever? We don't know. And you'll never know. Some analysts may be able to come up with some pretty good guesses, but we're trusting the guesses of, yes, probably very well-educated people, but we're trusting that they're being honest, and we're trusting that they're accurate, things that you really don't know, and they don't really know either. We also have the very real problem in the United States that is projected that a great amount of instability in the government is coming. The upcoming elections are going to be almost certainly between wildly unpopular candidates that are highly divisive and have separated the country in such a way that both sides are potentially gearing up for the possibility of armed conflict again, and at least one candidate has openly said that they would operate as a dictator, suspending democracy completely and the rule of law. This is a big deal as far as projected instability. That doesn't mean that the U.S. will fall apart, but it means that the chances of it falling apart and the acceptance by society that falling apart may be what they're looking for is very, very high. In Latin America, we often think of these countries as being, the Latin American countries that is, as being unstable in general, because Latin Americans have a tendency through democratic processes, in most cases, lean towards violent or dramatic upheavals to their governments on a semi-regular basis, kind of like a difference between a rotation farmer who changes their crops from season to season to keep the ground from becoming infertile versus someone who grows the same crop for a number of years and then burns it and lets the field sit for a few years. Latin America leans towards a more dramatic revitalization of their institutions, whereas, say, North America has a tendency to try to temper that and have longer, slower, and more mild changes over time, but both still have quite a bit of upheaval, but in very different ways. So we tend to view them a little bit differently. Most of Latin America tends to accept that a large amount of government upheaval is just part of life, and that's part of the process, or accepted to be. Maybe that's not the best answer, but it is potentially normal, and living through that, again, may not be a thing you actually care about. I was actually in North Macedonia when it went through a change of government, and it was a little bit scary because as an American, that's something we don't see very often. Protest in the street, people with machine guns marching through, people throwing paint balls at each other. It got a little bit dramatic, and the government had a major change. We did decide to leave out of an abundance of caution. We had our children with us, but at no point were we actually in danger. And if I had lived there rather than been visiting, and if I had lived somewhere other than on the direct downtown intersection where I was staying in the hotel where the protests were taking place, may have just ignored the whole thing because as an expat, made no difference whatsoever. Just to be clear, I was a tourist there, not an expat. But had I been an expat, it would have made no difference to me whatsoever in the short term or the long term. So that was a great example of where there was high instability, no impact. Now, we tend to hear instability applied to places as kind of a curse put upon them as, oh, you don't want to move there because it's unstable. Now, we've already established that that's probably pointless. You don't care. We've also established that a lot of places you might be coming from look at stability just very differently, and it's hard to define. It's hard to know when a place is or is not stable. But we do have some real stability concerns, ignoring the United States, which of course has some very strong stability concerns, hence why it's an effective tool to manipulate people. But what's going on in the region today, this actually is very important for us to look at. So like I said, Argentina and Brazil have had some major voting-based government changes. So they've been unstable, but only unstable in such a way that their democratic processes have allowed the populace to make upheaval happen through accepted ways, and it seems to have worked very well in both cases. Very big changes in both countries, but very important ones, and it worked in a very peaceful way. Now, could there be uprisings, or could there be protests, or could there be something that happens because of those changes before they fully take effect or whatever? Yes, absolutely, and that's possible. We accept that could happen, but we don't have any expectation of it. We can't really say, oh, you don't want to go to Argentina, there's going to be all this upheaval. No, we have no idea if there's going to be upheaval. It could be the most peaceful thing ever. It could be the most calm thing ever. It could be that nothing's going to change. Or maybe a lot of things are going to change, but will it affect an expat? Probably not. Will it affect my decision making on whether or not to go to Argentina and spend a lot of time there? Absolutely not. It did influence me to say maybe I don't want to be there on the day of the election, but that's not the same as government instability. That's just don't be there on a day. Don't choose to go there specifically on a day where a lot of crazy things could happen. But mostly my concern is logistics. What if the airport gets inundated? What if the roads get closed for a day or two? That can be annoying. I'm not worried about my safety, but I could be worried about making my flight or something of the nature, or just having a bad time on my vacation because I can't get to where I want to go, stuck in traffic, that kind of thing. But let's talk about some of the countries we generally assume to be stable and we don't worry about telling people to travel to at all. This is really important because coming from the United States, they're often like, oh yeah, Panama, so safe and stable. Guatemala, nice, safe, stable. Maybe it's got some violence problems, but mostly you can stay away from those areas. These are great places to go on vacation. Maybe good places to go as an expat. The U.S. really doesn't push many expat locations, but they do really discourage some places and simply ignore others. But when it comes to things like stability, you never hear people talking about Panama or Guatemala as being unstable. We just had first camera overheat. So just a reference, the original bit was all recorded on the GoPro 12 in HDR, and now we're on the GoPro 11 in standard. So Guatemala and Panama are often used as examples of stability in the region. These are places that are highly encouraged for people to go to because they're very stable. However, both of these countries are currently in the throes of major protests that are dramatically affecting the countries. Both are accusing their governments of extreme levels of corruption, and both are looking at the potential of an overthrow of their governments. Active, potentially violent. In Guatemala, this has been going on for months. In Panama, it's been going on for weeks. They are extreme levels of concern. We have people who are living in those countries contacting us here saying maybe they want to come to Nicaragua to get to some place that's more stable, given that those places that they thought were going to be very stable are not, and the type of instability that they have is a little bit concerning. There's a lot of protests in the streets. There has been some absolute disruption to logistics and business and those kinds of things. I'm not aware of there being any violence that anyone, maybe protesters, but no one else has to worry about. I would not be encouraging people who are in those countries to make rash decisions. Of course, pay attention, think about what matters to you, but generally protests like this are not things that are going to spill over into expat life outside of traffic congestion or things like that. But be smart, and I am not on the ground in either of those countries during those protests. I've made a point of avoiding them. They certainly become bad places to choose to travel to during a protest. Like, let's just be realistic, that would be stupid. If I needed to go, I wouldn't be worried, but going for fun during protest is an awkward thing to do at best. Great way to have everything go wrong on your trip and spend all of your time sitting in traffic or worse. So those things are going on right now, but we aren't worried about, no one is getting warned about, and no one talks about stability issues there, except for the people who are actually living there who are saying, I'm looking at moving. But when people are talking about, I'm interested in Nicaragua, I'm interested in Panama, we don't hear people go, but I'm worried about the instability. I'm worried about the uprisings against the government. I'm worried about the corruption that they're talking about. I'm worried about the potential overthrow of the government with a lot of possible changes, right? One of the things that they're very upset about in Panama is there collusion with North American powers? That specifically is what's going on. The protests are generally being triggered by Canadian companies that are harvesting minerals out of the country, possibly illegally. I have no comment on whether it's truly illegal or not, but that is kind of the claim. So those kinds of things could result in some pretty dramatic changes and make it a little bit worrisome, because these are places where people are calling into question the mandate of the government to rule. Yet you hear lots of people say, but I've been told that Nicaragua is unstable and I don't want to go there. I'm scared of that. And so, again, those original questions, why would that scare you? Who cares that it's unstable? Of course, we don't wish instability on anyone. We're not saying we don't care. We're not callous. But as expats, as digital nomads, as tourists, these aren't things that affect us. So why do we care in that way? And possibly if that instability is getting someone what they want as a people, well, then that's a good thing. So we want that. Just as everyone who's creating the instability in Panama and Guatemala and the United States is doing so because they want the results of change, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can cause some momentary concern, but really not something we have to worry about. So the first part is, so we ask, so do you care? And here in Nicaragua, I think the answer is no. There's no signs of a type of instability that would cause anyone to care one way or another as expats. Then the next thing, so which of the type of instability do we have? Is there a historic instability that's been going on over the last 3-4 years that is culminating into something? Well, no, it's actually been one of the most stable countries from a government perspective in the region, right? Far more stable than the United States, far more stable than any of the neighboring countries. Now, some of them are quite stable. It's not to say that there's lots of instability in the region. There's a few, of course, but in general, things have been pretty stable through quite a number of the countries in the area, and Nicaragua leads the pack in stability. That's not to make a commentary on it being good or bad. Again, stability is kind of an under-the-hood artifact. It's not on its own something that you particularly want or don't want, but if you were to want it, historically, over the last 30 to 40 years, actually almost 40 years, Nicaragua has been incredibly stable. It is only prior to 1979 that there was a high degree of active instability. Of course, there was a U.S.-backed war going on in the country throughout the 80s. You could argue that that was instability, but it was not government instability. It was military instability through invasion. The actual government here in the country remained united, and the people remained united primarily behind it. There are, of course, like in the United States and everywhere else, lots of opposition people who just want anything that isn't the current government, but in general, the populace has been, and all international sources agree, that it has been stable with a lot of support from the people. There's been brief periods where the opposition parties, which of course at the time were not the opposition, they became the primary parties, came into power briefly and were voted back out again. That's the same type of instabilities you get in the United States when you have a Democratic president and then a Republican gets voted in and then goes back to Democrat again, as we see on a regular basis. Or vice versa. The same kind of things happen here. Is that a form of instability? Of course it is, but that has not happened for quite some time. So making Nicaragua actually one of the historically most stable governments in the region because of its strong longevity and general support and lack of really strong uprisings. Of course, people will point to some historical uprisings that happened more than half a decade ago. These were not necessarily very strong uprisings. That is something that is very much promoted from the outside as, oh, there was this huge number of people that were trying to exert control over the government, and that's not necessarily reflected on the ground, neither at the time nor since. That doesn't mean it's completely false, but it doesn't mean it's true either. It's simply there isn't a lot of evidence for that having been here. But that was over half a decade ago, and in the time since, again, the country has been incredibly stable. That doesn't mean you're going to like everything about it. It doesn't mean that you agree with those processes. When it comes to the question of stability, it is unquestionably stable historically. So then it must be that people are pointing to a future of instability. But this begs another question. What factors would point to future instability? There's nothing on the docket that gives us those kinds of worries when you're actually here. Again, if you're in the United States, you can point to future instability because there's a known election coming up where there's an expected flip of government, and that government has not only been very different, very much of a flip compared to the current one, but it also has outright stated that it will suspend the entire legal and political framework of the country, causing the greatest instability you could possibly imagine in the United States, short of an invasion from a foreign power. So the expectation of instability in the United States is at an all-time high. This is a level of extreme that the populace may be voting, and I'm not making a commentary on whether this is good or bad, but you may have a majority of the population voting for what is essentially a complete burn down and refabrication of the entire government system. That's dramatic. It's not necessarily bad. That is what we do in Latin America for reforming governments, and so that's not without precedence, but it is without precedence inside the United States itself. And so this is definitely instability on a level the United States is not really well prepared for, even if just emotionally and mentally. So we know that in the United States is coming. We know that recently we looked at Argentina as having some potential instability because we knew a vote of similar magnitude was coming. But it came and went, and the government remained stable. Different, it changed, but we didn't have this big uprising. So we accept that it's a little bit of instability because of this flip, but it's not a huge amount like you would have with, say, a coup d'etat. Here we don't have any of those factors. We do not have an upcoming election where there's an expectation of a great flip, and even if an opposition party was elected, generally that results in very little change. It's not expected to be a complete burn down of the government in the way that we're been told the expected vote is going to go for in the United States. That doesn't mean it will go for that, but it's the expectation. The more than 50% chance is leaning that way. Here in Nicaragua, we have nothing like that coming up. We don't have any hotly contested elections coming up. We don't have any big changes of public opinion that have happened. We don't have anything on the ground that indicates that there's any cause for concern for future stability. Of course, any place can have instability. There can suddenly be an uprising. There can suddenly be a change of government. There can suddenly be a death or an invasion. All kinds of things can happen. And that's like what happened in Chile in 1973, but they couldn't see it coming. It's not something you could warn about, maybe if you worked for the CIA, but not normal people. You can't use that information in that way. So it begs the question, based on what are people saying that there's going to be or is instability in Nicaragua when observation on the ground or even from remote shows that there is absolutely no cause for instability concern. You can have any concern you want about something that's actually happening, but instability isn't one of them. So it's a very specific accusation that has so little foundation, it's very strange. Both that it has no foundation in why would you care if it was unstable, it doesn't affect you, and what about it are people claiming is unstable? And when I've asked this, they mention things that are completely the opposite of instability. Well, they've had the same president for quite a few years. How is that unstable, right? That's a lot like I'm building a building. It's been through some earthquakes and it didn't fall down. That's a stable building. You may have all kinds of opinions as to whether or not you like its architecture, you don't like how it's air conditioned, you don't think it fits in the block that it's been built in. All those things could be valid, and they're your opinion to like or dislike a building. But that it's been through earthquakes and has had no structural damage makes it stable. That's kind of the situation that's going on here. The government in Nicaragua is and has been stable. Now, you may not like it. It may not be the government you want. There's lots of things that you could have opinions about, and that's potentially valid. But that it's unstable seems to be not a matter of opinion. It is simply factually stable historically, and until someone produces some reason to believe it's going to be unstable in the future, we have to assume that it's stable. And now I'm using Nicaragua as an example and the United States as an example because typically we get the accusation from Americans, normally through their propaganda, that some place that the U.S. is trying to discourage travel to has been labeled as unstable. And places that they want to encourage travel to don't get labeled anything. And Nicaragua is often singled out as being unstable as a specific accusation against it when it is the farthest thing from that you could reasonably find as an example. I'm assuming that places like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia also stand as examples of incredible stability. They've had very little political change over quite a long time. Decades for sure, many decades, right? So if your question is Saudi Arabia stable? Well, there's nothing historically to give it a precedent within any kind of recent time frame to indicate instability, and there's nothing on its horizon that would indicate the potential of instability in the future. So like or hate, love, just not interested in Saudi Arabia doesn't matter. Its stability would seem to be unquestionable, and that's kind of the same way here. It's simply a stable system. So I think it's very important when you're getting these things. Stability, of course, is its own topic, but so often the things that we hear about foreign countries from home countries, and it's not just the US, Canada does this a lot. The UK does this quite a bit. A lot of these countries, and everyone's country does it, right? Everyone, anytime they don't want you going somewhere, they'll say something bad about that country, and people often just listen to it. Or even if they don't mean to, much like false house prices, once you hear it a few times, you start to worry about it regardless. And it's very important to remember, just because our home countries make statements about other countries does not even imply that there's a basis of truth for it. There could be at times, but much of the time there is none. So it's very important to remember to think about anything, right? It doesn't have to be stability. It could be any of the factors that we're told about. Do we actually care? Regardless of whether or not the thing is true, does it impact us, right? There's a lot of claims you can make against a country. This country does not produce yucca. Oh my gosh, they don't produce yucca. That's terrible. First question, do you care if they produce yucca? Oh wait, no, I don't eat yucca. That's fine. Okay, so you don't care. And then you should still ask, is it true that they don't produce yucca? Well, they're the world's third largest exporter of yucca. It seems like they must be producing it. Why would they say that they're not? Both of these things should be applied universally when you're told these things. And we hear so many people, it is so effective, right? One of my viewers, quite some time ago, like 6 to 12 months ago, I can't remember, was here and he said he really wanted to go visit El Salvador, but the Canadian government, he was Canadian, had told his wife, not him, but his wife, that Honduras was so dangerous you couldn't transit it, which of course is not true. We transit it all the time. I'd be happy to walk across it, like zero concerns whatsoever. Is Honduras a relatively dangerous country? Sure. More dangerous than El Salvador and Nicaragua by far. As dangerous as Guatemala? I don't think so at the moment. But neither one is that terrible at this point, as long as you know what you're doing, right? Go to a gang-controlled zone, do something stupid, of course, it's dangerous. But you want to cross through a major highway and a tourist zone, it is completely safe. Right? So they told his wife this very easily verified false fact with no foundation whatsoever that Honduras is so dangerous you can't do the very short drive along the ocean between Nicaragua and El Salvador. And it was an effective way to keep people from visiting El Salvador and Nicaragua, right? Because anyone transiting in either direction would be like, no, I can't go across Honduras, which lies between. So all they had to do was accuse a third-party country who has nothing to do with the situation, and they effectively crippled a whole bunch of tourism in the zone. Was it true? No. Did they have to say it to the person who was going to go there? No. The amount of this is a really effective emotional and psychological warfare tactic is incredible. All they had to do was convince his spouse that he would be in danger if he went to this place that clearly was safe, so that he couldn't go to some other place that they couldn't even make the claim that it's dangerous because it's safer than Canada at this point. That's El Salvador. Sadly, Nicaragua has fallen in the rankings. Canada is safer completely, and Nicaragua is now currently having a bad year, and for this one particular year is currently ranked basically the same as the United States. We're very sad about that. We're coming back, I'm sure of it. We'll see when the 2023 rankings come out. 2022, just not our best year, but our 3-year average, we're still like way ahead of the United States. So I think just a few things happened, a little bit of stress going on or something in the country in 2022, which is the numbers we currently have. So anyway, that evaluating those numbers and really asking yourself, does this matter? Is it true? And almost always, no. Most countries, most worldwide, are safe for you to go to, friendly and welcoming, gonna let you in, and especially the United States, but all the Western countries have a tendency towards very strongly trying to discourage foreign travel because it costs them money. It's a huge outflow of their funds, and it often supports countries and governments and ideologies that, if people find out about those places and learn how those places work, sometimes they bring those things back and are disruptive to those original countries, and they don't like that. There's lots of reasons that especially the major Western powers don't want you experiencing what the rest of the world is like. Not because the rest of the world has it all together, but because they're doing things differently, and often things that are said would never work in America, right? We could never do this thing. Oh, but it works over here. Clearly you could do it under the right conditions. Why are we not considering it, right? If you don't want people to consider it, you got to make them think that it's not working anywhere, right? And there's lots of these types of things, but it's a very powerful tool, and it's a very scary thing when you're a government and everything you do depends on people believing that you're doing the only thing you can do, so you don't have to evaluate alternatives, prove that you're doing the best job that you can, and so forth. Feels like a rant today, but I feel like this is really important information, and it's not. This is important. It's not the United States that's being bad here. It's not Nicaragua that's being good here. Everyone has some amount of stability and instability. Everyone needs to evaluate whether the things that they're told is true. Lots of countries accuse other countries of stability and instability, and one of the reasons it's so powerful, beyond that its instability is definitely a problem in the United States, so it's easy to get people emotionally worked up about it, is that nobody can really define or prove stability. So it's a really easy accusation to make, because try to prove that I don't know something you don't know. And all it takes is the United States saying, we are clearly considering invading this country, therefore it's unstable, right? Not that it will be overthrown, but if we decide, and since only we can decide how likely we are to overthrow it, then only we can make a call on whether or not it is stable or unstable. To give a quick example on this, imagine a 5-year-old who's being given a birthday cake. The cake is sitting in the middle of the table. Under normal conditions, you would look at the cake in the middle of the table and say, that cake has no chance of falling off of the table. Even a 9.0 earthquake wouldn't move it more than an inch or two. It's not going anywhere. But when that child or a cat come onto the table, it may simply walk up, grab the cake, and throw it on the floor. Was the cake in a state of potential instability? It turns out it was. But the only person that knows if it's going to be stable or unstable is that child or that cat, and it is actually a decision to make it unstable, not an inherent aspect of the cake itself, which gets into a very esoteric discussion as to what does instability even mean in those contexts. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. I ask that you share this on social media, watch an extra episode, tell your friends about the show, post on Facebook, all that kind of stuff. Get the news out, let people know about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.